The Gearhead Woodshop. In this video, I'm going to be making a built-in cabinet for our family room. If your house is anything like mine, then you never seem to have enough storage. When I bought this house, this is what the back wall of our family room looked like. After completely renovating the kitchen, which was worse than it looks, and updating the family room, we still have this open space on the back wall. For now, I'm just going to build the base cabinets with a countertop. I'm also going to try and match the kitchen cabinets, which I bought ready to assemble, including this 2-inch bump out for the middle cabinet. Since we have too many kids and not enough space, this is also going to double as our baby storage and changing station. I don't mean we're going to store the baby here, like this is going to store the baby stuff, and then we'll keep that baby somewhere else. Anyway, I always like to start by drawing up a plan. This time I made a cardboard template to give myself a rough idea what this might look like, or at least how much space it will take up. I'd prefer it to go all the way to the end of the wall, but then it blocks too much of the entryway, especially coming down the hallway, so I'm going to leave some space on the end and probably just stick a plant there or something when we're all done. With the plans done, I went to the big box store and picked up some wood. I don't have a bulkhead, so I cut up the plywood into more manageable pieces to bring down to my basement shop. This will come back to bite me later when I realize the wall and the floor are so far out that my top is going to be about 1/8 of an inch too narrow, and I'll have to go back to the store and buy another $85 sheet of plywood. I start by cutting the sides of the cabinets. The center cabinet will be 18 inches deep, and the two side cabinets will be 16 inches deep. Then I cut the bottoms, the shelves, and the stretchers. Next, I laid everything out and marked where each piece would go, making sure the nicest surface was the part that would be seen. Then I set up this pocket hole jig and drilled a whole bunch of holes. I prefer to use pocket screws because they're pretty easy, they make strong joints, and they can be hidden or barely visible when you're all done. I drilled the holes into the back of all the stretchers and the underside of the bottoms, so none of them would be visible when the cabinets are fully assembled. Then I cut a rabbet in the back of each side and bottom shelf for the 1/4-inch back panel to fit in. For each cabinet, I laid the two sides next to each other and drew a line at 2 5/8 inches. Then lined up the bottom shelf with the sides and attached them using 1 1/4-inch pocket screws. Then I attached the 3 stretchers, 1 in the front and 2 in the back. These will give the cabinets added support and a strong place for me to anchor them to the wall and screw the top to. I repeated this process again with the other 2 cabinets. After making sure everything looked good and was square and level, I took them apart piece by piece to add glue and assemble the cabinets permanently. Now, it's not totally necessary to use glue when assembling cabinets, but it does add strength to them, and given the amount of abuse these things are probably going to take, they can use all the extra help they can get. Then I cut the back panels out of 1/4-inch plywood and attached them with a brad nailer. With the boxes assembled, it was time to start on the face frames. I ripped a bunch of 1x4s on the table saw to various widths based on how much of the face I wanted to see around the doors. I wanted the doors to overhang the face by about 3/4 of an inch and leave about 1/8 of an inch between the door and the top and bottom trim. On the sides, I wanted the face to be about 1 inch wider than the cabinet, acting as a filler panel between cabinets. This will allow the doors to open fully without hitting the middle cabinet that bumps out. and that's probably way more numbers and details than anybody cares about. Basically, the face frame just covers up the plywood edges and makes the whole thing look finished when it's assembled. With all the pieces cut to size, I drilled a bunch of pocket holes, then glued and screwed them together using these corner clamps to keep everything fitting flush and square. Once the glue had dried, I did a quick test fit, then glued and nailed the face frame to the cabinet. I made sure the bottom and the sides were sitting flush with the edges, then clamped everything down before nailing it in place. The battery on my nail gun ran low, so not all the nails went all the way in. A couple quick taps with a nail set, and they were good to go. Then I applied wood filler to all the nail holes and seams. Now it's time for my least favorite part of any project, and that's sanding. I used 320 grit sandpaper on my orbital sander to smooth out the wood filler and make sure all my seams were perfectly flat. I wasn't really happy with the way the bottoms fit together and tried to smooth it out with a coarser grit sandpaper. That just made things worse, and I had to go back with some wood filler to smooth it all out. I was frustrated and didn't actually get any of that on camera, but this is what it looks like after, and it all turns out fine. With the boxes finished, I measured for the doors and cut the 1x4s to length. Building a shaker style door is pretty simple. You have your stiles, which are the vertical pieces, and the rails, which are the horizontal. You cut a groove on the inside of all 4 pieces and a tongue on the sides of the rails. Then the rails fit into the stiles and the panel fits in the middle. I've always made tongue and groove joints on the table saw, which always takes forever and makes a mess. That's why I built this router table into my workbench, specifically for this project, so I can use these tongue and groove bits on my router to make the joints. Well, like most things with this cheap router table that didn't work so well, the fence is too small for the bits to fit in, and it's not adjustable. I tried drilling a hole in a 2x4 and clamping it to the fence, which surprisingly worked okay, but I ended up going back to the table saw for most of the cuts and using a flush trim bit on the router to clean them up. The doors on my kitchen cabinets have a groove cut on the rails where they meet the stiles, so to match that, I set my table saw depth to about 1/8 of an inch and cut a little more than a 16th off the edge of each rail. Making cabinets is a very repetitive process. I'm making 3 cabinets, so that's 6 doors and a total of 12 rails. Each rail gets this cut on all 4 edges, meaning I have to make this cut 48 times. Now I just have to cut out the center panels, then do a quick dry fit before gluing them up permanently. There are some pretty heated debates on the internet about whether or not you should glue in the center panel. Wood does expand and contract, so I understand the argument, but every time I've tried this without glue, the door rattles, and I've never had an issue gluing it, so that's the way I do it. I let the glue dry overnight, then inspect my work. I'm making sure no glue squeezed out anywhere and everything fits the way it should. If you're wondering what the blue painter's tape is for, I use that to mark each piece as I dry fit them so I don't mix anything up when I'm banging out 6 doors worth of parts. While I was making the doors, I made an extra one to use as an end panel, but when test fitting, I realized it was going to look weird because the face of the cabinet added 3/4 of an inch to that one side. Rather than starting over, I cut 3/8 of an inch off that side and attached it to the other side. So if you look carefully, the end panel actually has 3 and 7/8 inch styles compared to 3.5 inch on the doors. And yes, this is going to bother me for the rest of my life, though I don't think a normal person would notice. To finish the doors, I used this hinge jig to drill all the holes for the hinges. This jig is awesome. It takes all the guesswork and measuring out of it. Simply press it against the sides of the doors, and it locates the holes in the same spot each time. There's also a stop collar on the Forstner bit, so the depth of the hole will be perfect every time. With the doors just about finished, it's finally time to bring the cabinets upstairs and start installing them. I set the cabinets in place and could finally start to see what this was actually going to look like. Then I marked the trim about an inch short of the actual width so I could remove the rear baseboard and fit the first cabinet against the wall. Then I used an oscillating saw to cut out the baseboards and fit the cabinets. With that out of the way, I slid the first cabinet back into place and made sure it was level. Then I marked and cut out the baseboard so I could finally slide it into its permanent location. Getting these cabinets level was a particular pain in the butt. The floor slopes down and away from the wall, and also down to the right, all while the wall angles away from the floor from the bottom to the top. So getting these things level from side to side and front to back took me quite a while. I used shims under each cabinet, making sure they were level as I went. Once all 3 cabinets were good, I marked all the studs. Then I used a laser level to mark a line across the back wall. This will help me get the finished height right regardless of how far out the floor is. And finally, I attached the cabinets to the studs using shims to take up the gap made by the wall being so far out. I pre-drilled holes through the stretchers and the shims so they wouldn't split, then used cabinet screws to permanently install them. On this first one, I just eyeballed it and then didn't like how the screws were not perfectly straight, so I went back with a square and tried again. I used some wood filler to cover up my mistake and did it right the first time on the rest of the cabinets. I also wanted to secure the first cabinet to the side wall, so I made some spacers out of scrap by gluing a piece of 1/4 inch to a piece of 3/4 and used that to fill in the gap between the cabinet and the wall where the stud is. I'm going to permanently attach the shelves right in the middle of the cabinet, so I located this screw where it will be hidden behind the shelf. Then I pre-drilled and countersunk the hole, attached the spacer, and screwed it all to the wall. The second cabinet was a little trickier because not only did I have to deal with the wall and the floor, I also have this outlet that I need access to inside the cabinet. So once I got the cabinet close to where I wanted it, I put the 3/4 inch outlet extender in front of the outlet and used painter's tape to mark where the hole needs to be in the back of the cabinet. Generally, you would use paint or grease, or I've even seen people online use toothpaste to mark the outlets in the back of cabinets, but I didn't want to make a mess, and the painter's tape method worked okay enough for this project. I used a measuring tape to double check that I had marked the right location, then drilled holes in each corner to make absolutely sure I was in the right spot before I went at it with my multi-tool and cut out the rectangle. Then I installed the outlet extender the right way, confirmed fitment, and finished installing the middle cabinet. Since I hit 3 studs nicely, one on each side and one in the middle, I used just 1 screw in each rather than 2 screws in 2 studs like I did on the side cabinets. I installed the third cabinet and confirmed everything was still level. Then I trimmed the shims flush with the top of the cabinets and did my first test fit of the top. It's not great. I was going to start on the trim next, so I cut a piece of 1x4 to 30 inches and dropped it on the floor. Then I ripped it down to 2 3/8 inches tall and cut a 45-degree miter for the inside corner. Before installing the trim, I thought it would be a good idea to check that the doors actually fit, since it would be easier to adjust the size of the trim than to remake all the doors. So I installed a set of hinges using a square to make sure they're straight. It's also important to pre-drill the holes and not over-tighten these screws so the wood doesn't crack. I start these with a drill, but not super tight, so I can give it a little turn by hand on the final install after paint. Then I temporarily set the trim in place and used an 1/8 inch spacer to rest the door on while I screwed the hinges into the cabinet. Just like with the doors, I pre-drilled the holes and carefully drove in the screws, finishing them off by hand. I installed the second door the same way and then checked the fitment. Fortunately, I did measure correctly this time, so I'll have about an 1/8 of an inch gap all around the door. Once I knew the doors fit, I got to work on the rest of the trim. There's a lot of repetitive measuring and cutting, up and down the stairs, and more measuring and cutting, but eventually I got all the trim pieces cut and loosely fitted into place. While I was installing the rest of the doors, I attached the cabinets to each other using trim screws through the face frame into the side of the adjacent cabinet. I really liked the way this was all coming together, but I wanted to make this look a little more interesting, a little more visually appealing, I guess. So I decided to add a chamfer to the trim and see what that looked like. I thought that gave this the visual appeal that was missing, so I set up my router table with a 45-degree chamfer bit and ran all the trim pieces through it. I like the way this looks with square corners, and that made things a little bit trickier. I marked the back where I wanted to start each chamfer and carefully cut each piece, leaving about a 1/4 inch of the square edge on each end. And now the last piece of the puzzle, the top. The first problem is I cut the top based off the cabinet measurements before I saw how bad the wall was, and it's not going to have enough overhang. So, after another trip to the store and cutting my new $85 sheet of plywood, I'm ready to attack problem number 2. There's an old carpenter's trick where you measure the furthest out part of the wall, then use a spacer that size as a guide to scribe your line. That way, your line follows all the imperfections in the wall and transfers them to the board. It looks really smooth when someone does this properly. This isn't that. My second attempt would have been a little better, but I bumped the camera. Fortunately, not cutting straight lines with a circular saw is a specialty of mine, so this actually turned out pretty good. Even though I made this work, I just didn't like it given how bad the wall is, so I decided to change my plans, and I'm going to hide it with a shiplap accent wall. This piece of trim will cover the gap and frame the shiplap, but that will mean my 96-inch top is now 3/4 of an inch too short. So I glued and screwed this filler piece into the top, which, as terrible as it looks now, will not be noticeable at all once it's painted. Seriously, you guys will know it's there, but no one who sees this in person has any idea. Now that the length and depth are all set, I can mark the cut lines for the bump out. I started these cuts with the circular saw, then awkwardly cut the long side on the table saw, and finished them off with a rusty handsaw that I'm pretty sure is older than I am. It may not be pretty, but it is square. And the final fitment is pretty good. Next, I measured each section for the edge nosing and cut it out of 3/4 by 1.5 inch strips I had ripped down earlier. Then I glued and nailed them all into place. With the trim against the wall figured out, I finished the last piece of trim on the cabinet and nailed it all into place. Then I went around the whole thing with the wood filler and took care of all the nail holes. The last thing before disassembly is drilling the holes for the handles. Normally I'd put them a little lower, maybe 2/3 of the way up the door, but because these are the same style and right next to the kitchen cabinets, I decided to match the handle placement with those. That means measuring 1 3/4 inches from the top inside corner for the top hole and 5 inches below that for the other hole. Normally, I would make a jig out of some scrap wood, which would keep the holes consistent and make drilling a little bit faster, but I was too lazy to run up and down the stairs and make one, and there's only 6 doors, so I just measured out each one. I'm not sure that saved any time, but it's done. At this point, we're pretty much done. All I have to do is take the whole thing apart, fit the shelves, sand everything, clean everything, paint everything, put it all back together again, do some final touch-ups, and we should be good to use it. Well, I have to finish the wall too, but that'll be a project for another day. So I got to work disassembling everything. I removed the doors and the hinges, carefully marking each one so I could put it all back together the same way after paint. I sanded down all the doors with 320 grit sandpaper, front and back, then removed the top and gave that a quick sanding. I wanted the edge to match my kitchen counters, so I used an 1/8 inch roundover bit on my palm router to knock down all the edges. I used painter's tape to mark about a 1/2 inch from each end that I wanted to leave as a squared edge to match the lower trim, and again, that's how my kitchen counters are. Then I put a light coat of wood filler over all the seams, and when it dried, I sanded it all smooth. Since I'm going to need access to the outlet in the middle cabinet, I installed a 2-inch cable grommet in the top. First, I marked roughly where I wanted it to be, then marked its exact location on the stretcher. I drilled a hole through the center, then up through the top so my hole saw would be perfectly aligned when I drilled through both pieces. When drilling with a hole saw, I find it helpful to go slow and clean out the sawdust every once in a while. You should also make sure the bit is really secure so this doesn't happen. With the top all ready for paint, I finished prepping the cabinets by drilling some holes with my countersink bit to secure the top. Then the final step before paint. Another hotly debated topic on the internet is whether or not you should use caulk on cabinets. I usually do. Personally, I think it looks better, and even if you do eventually get some hairline cracks, I think that's usually less noticeable than the gaps that are currently there. There's an old saying, caulk and paint make me the carpenter I ain't, and I think that might apply here. When it comes to painting cabinets, it's always better to spray them. I do have a paint sprayer, but it was too cold in the garage and I don't really have a place inside that I could spray them, so I decided to do these the old-fashioned way with a brush and a roller. Personally, I like to use Benjamin Moore paint. I put 2 coats of Fresh Start primer on all bare wood surfaces and do a light sanding in between coats. It's also important to use a high-quality, fine bristle brush and a short nap, lint-free roller. This is one area you want to use the highest quality materials possible to get the best finish that you can. I laid all the doors and shelves on the workbench and gave them each 2 coats of primer on both sides with a quick sanding in between coats. And this is where I really miss using the paint sprayer. Watching someone paint is about as exciting as, well, watching paint dry, so let's just skip ahead. I really like Ben Moore Advanced Paint for cabinets and trim. It can be a little tricky to work with, and it does take forever to dry, but it gives you a really flat, hard finish. In my opinion, it's the best water-based paint you can use for cabinets. Generally speaking, an enamel will give you a better finish, but I prefer working with water-based paints, so this is what I use. For this project, I went with a satin finish to match my kitchen. Semi-gloss probably would have been a better choice to stand up to the wear and tear of 3 kids, but it's just a little too shiny for my taste in this space. I sanded the top after the first coat, then permanently installed it so I could caulk all the edges before the final coat. Once that dried, I popped in the wire grommet and stopped to admire my work. And that's enough of that. To finish off the shelves, I applied edge banding to the exposed plywood edge. This is an easy way to finish off a plywood project if you don't want to do face framing. It's just a melamine strip with an adhesive back. To install, just cut an oversized piece and apply heat with an iron to activate the adhesive. I like to warm it up till it's almost too hot to touch, but not so hot you melt or burn it. Then simply cut the edges flush and use a banding trimmer for a perfect finish. I cut a couple of 2x4s to 15 inches to hold up my shelves at the proper height. After confirming they were level, I permanently installed them with pocket screws. With all the shelves installed, the only thing left is the doors. So one at a time, I reinstalled the hinges, then the door, and the handle. And just like that, we're all done. This is getting kind of long, so in my next video, I'll show you how I made this shiplap accent wall using 1/4-inch plywood. Since it takes me forever to edit these videos, we've been able to live with this for a few weeks now, and I'm pretty happy with the results. It really makes the room look finished, and the functionality is perfect for our growing family. We are able to fit all the baby clothes, diapers, blankets, extra everything in here, and have a dedicated changing area without having to disturb my other kids in the bedroom. Personally, I think this looks great, and it certainly gets a lot of attention when people stop by to visit. If you're considering a built-in project of your own, I highly recommend skipping the Ikea hacks and pre-made cabinets. All you really need to do this is a table saw and some basic tools you probably already own. In most cases, you could buy the tools and materials cheaper than buying a bunch of ready-made cabinets anyway, and you'll probably get a better result since you're choosing the materials yourself. This also allows you to adjust the sizes to fit your space and your needs. Yes, it will take you longer to do and involve more labor, but the end result will most likely be better and cheaper. While this is definitely a big project to take on, I would encourage anyone thinking about it to give it a try. It's really not all that difficult to do, it just requires a fair bit of planning and patience. Problems do pop up and mistakes will be made, but stick with it and make adjustments as needed. As long as you have a well thought out plan and don't rush through things, there's a pretty good chance you'll end up with something you can be proud of. Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit that like button, consider subscribing, and good luck to you on your next project.